Welcome, everybody, to Crystal Kyle and Friends. Today, we're happy to have Pisco with us. Pisco, thanks for joining us, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
So, I don't know if you saw this, but not too long ago, our president posted a threat to invoke the Insurrection Act. I want to go ahead and read it here for you. He says, if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota don't obey the law and stop professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE, who are only trying to do their job, I will institute the Insurrection Act, which many presidents have done before me, and quickly put an end to the travesty that is taking place in the once great state. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So, Pisco, when I look at this, what I said to Crystal is, he already used the U.S. military to invade U.S. cities. He's going to invoke the Insurrection Act anyway. And so that's my thoughts on it. So I feel like, look, if you're out in the streets, you have a right to defend yourself. I, of course, think that the Democrats should order the police to enforce the law and arrest any ICE agent that commits a crime. But I'm curious if this sort of like intimidation tactic will work. And if it will make it so that, I don't think the protesters are going to listen, but do I think that Democratic politicians might like sort of soften their rhetoric a little bit? Like Jacob Frey famously said the other day that he wasn't actually ordering ICE agents to be arrested if they commit crimes. I'm curious what your reaction to this is.
Yeah, first of all, my take is completely the same as yours about he was always going to invoke the Insurrection Act during his second term. Now, it's the case that other presidents in the past have invoked the Insurrection Act. I believe the last time it was invoked was during the LA riots by the first George Bush. So my take on that, on like what he was willing to do, he may have been stopped in the first term during the George Floyd protests and riots. I don't know if you recall, he said that Tim Walz did a wonderful job in that instance. And by and large, even though there were some overreaches by the federal government, even in that 2020 summer period, they collaborated with state actors. And in this case, I think that he's determined to do the Insurrection Act. And one of the reasons for that legally is he just got a bad ruling by the Supreme Court on another power that he was invoking to try to federalize the National Guard in California. In this case specifically, it was from Illinois. And so I think he's determined to do it. Now the question is, what will the legal ramifications of invoking the Insurrection Act be? The first is, I think it's entirely unclear. The language in the Insurrection Act at times, unfortunately, is pretty vague. And the Insurrection Act is not just a means by which you can federalize the National Guard. It also is an exception to posse comitatus. Posse comitatus is the law that in general makes it a crime for the military, the like actual parts of the military, to enforce civilian law. And so the Insurrection Act is a very powerful law. Now, it wasn't envisioned that this kind of situation would give rise to the Insurrection Act. Like the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, and the state actors, they're willing to play ball in terms of civilian law enforcement. They just want like federal ICE not to abuse their power and not to go and kill people and murder people. But that doesn't matter really, because the law, unfortunately, is a bit vague, and it'll be up to the Supreme Court, which is stacked with conservatives, to determine the scope of the law.
Will they do that fast, Pisco? Like if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and then there's a case over it, does it like go almost in like a fast lane to the Supreme Court, or do we have to sit around and wait until the whole thing is over anyway for them to then rule on it? Because I feel like that's a cheat code to let Trump do whatever he wants. Yeah. It's like, we're not actually going to rule on this right away. We'll see you in 6 months. And by then, the thing's over anyway.
Well, it depends, Kyle. If Trump is losing in the lower courts and he wants the Supreme Court to get involved, he has a fast lane. So there absolutely does exist a fast lane if he's on the receiving end of some bad opinions that he doesn't like. And what happens often is it goes to the shadow docket, the so-called shadow docket. And these emergency applications or these requests for temporary assistance, those are the ones that the Supreme Court rules on and kind of shows its hand on which direction it's going. The truth is, it took months for the Supreme Court to finally resolve like literally one or two interpretive issues on the other basis that they were trying to invoke to federalize the National Guard. But the lower courts, they kind of breezily will put in an order at some point. And if Trump decides to, or if he loses in the lower courts, this is assuming he loses, right? The Supreme Court probably will quickly be confronted with like an emergency application from the Justice Department to stay the lower court orders, assuming Trump loses.
So the other thing that came out, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but in an interview with Reuters, Trump floated that maybe we shouldn't even have midterm elections. He was expressing, frustration that historically a lot of times the person in power loses in the midterm elections. He says, quote, "It's some deep psychological thing, but when you win the presidency, you don't win the midterms." He then boasted he had accomplished so much that, quote, "When you think of it, we shouldn't even have an election." So I see a lot of people theorizing that the invocation of the Insurrection Act could be sort of a first step towards actually trying to suspend or mess with the midterm elections. Is that, do you see any possibility of that?
Well, he literally floated this in the run-up to the first transition of power to Biden. They were having conversations, if you recall, with like Sidney Powell and these other crazy people that they were proposing be special counsels to try to find fake election fraud that didn't exist. And so do I put it past Trump to try something like that? No. This is what I want to caution people, though. Don't get black-pilled and so scared that you do something stupid or that you start to think it doesn't matter and disengage, because that's what they want you to do. Trump will often float this, I'm running for a third term. By and large, the Constitution of the United States, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, puts the running of federal elections as a default presumption in state government hands. And that's what people are used to. They're used to their state and local officials running elections, yes, even for federal office. Now, Congress, if it wants to, can adjust the rules for the state and local elections for federal offices. But in general, legally, I think he's going to have a tough time using the Insurrection Act to justify fundamental changes to our elections. If you recall, the most important insurrection in our history, the Civil War, Lincoln had an election during that time. And famously, that was the precedent set by Lincoln there. And I think the Supreme Court and our courts will prevent Trump largely from trying to use the Insurrection Act as a way to bypass the actual midterm elections. That said, it doesn't mean he's not going to try. Right. And it doesn't mean that I expect that this won't be in court sometime soon.
Well, and Kyle, he had also said to the New York Times recently that he regretted not having the National Guard seize voting machines.
That's right.
So this is clearly on his mind, and he could see the writing on the wall about his poor standing and Republican stand to, face major defeats.
Totally. I think we're in trouble. I want to ask you, Pisco, when the court rules on these things, do they look at it from just like a factual perspective? So in other words, when you look at like the tariffs, they could say, well, there is no emergency, and you claim there was an emergency, therefore we're going to slap down the tariffs, right? And I guess my question is, can they say with this Insurrection Act thing that, you effectively created the crisis, and now you're invoking the Insurrection Act. So if you didn't create the crisis, we wouldn't be here, therefore you're not allowed to invoke the Insurrection Act. Or do they do it more, is it more of like a textual analysis where it's like it's more abstract and it's more the specific wording in the Constitution and they take it from that perspective? How do they view that?
It's an excellent question, Kyle, and it gets to the heart of this entire administration. And it's not just this issue. It's also the issue of the Alien Enemies Act. It's also the issue of whether Trump can just stop congressionally approved funding. The question relates to who decides and how much deference is the Supreme Court going to give to Trump when he invokes these different implied powers or these different emergencies. Let me give you the bad news. The bad news is, I believe, that you have 4 justices on the Supreme Court, at least, who are willing to say, so long as the president writes a strongly worded memo, that we're going to defer to him when it comes to emergencies, basically of any kind. And there are even some lower federal courts that take this view, a kind of gloss on the unitary executive theory that says not only does all the executive power reside in the president, but on questions of national security, which he'll always just write a memo that incorporates national security or foreign powers concerns. They do this in immigration too, deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. What was the official reason? Well, it affects our international standing, or it affects our sovereign relations with other countries. So they absolutely will try to use those hooks to bait conservatives on the Supreme Court, of which I think at a bare minimum you have 4 who are just gung-ho willing to give deference. And the Insurrection Act, because it's vague, it's not clear who decides whether there is or is not an insurrection. And there's conflicting case law. There's some going back which says, well, the president determines certain situations when it comes to war and invasion, et cetera. But then you have the recent cases of the Alien Enemies Act, which says perhaps courts can review it. And that will be a factual question, as your question sort of implies. The more fundamental thing that we're not certain about is, under the Insurrection Act, how much deference do the courts have to give to the president's determinations as to the existence of one of the preconditions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking too about the way that all of these deployments of these kitted out, masked federal agents, you know, ICE and CBP and whoever else is in the mix. I mean, they all look like they're in Fallujah. Like they look like the military. And so on the one hand, obviously there's been mass public pushback to those invasions. On the other hand, there seems to be a concerted effort to normalize the idea of military troops on the streets enforcing civilian law. Because one question is what the courts are going to permit and allow, but you know, the population does get a say as well, as we're seeing right now in Minneapolis, where they're making it very difficult for ICE to be able to operate in the manner that they would like to be able to operate. And so I think that that's a part of the plan too, the previous deployments of the National Guard, and then the way that these federal agents are outfitted that look, you know, indistinguishable from soldiers out in the streets.
Yeah, I think that part of their calculation, is to provoke a certain response, to have a pretext. You remember the big balls guy from Elon Musk?
Oh, yeah.
He's one of the Doge kids who like was beat up or something. They'll try to find any excuse, but you can imagine when the people are trying to exercise their not liking having troops on the streets, that these kinds of tensions are the kind of tactics that some of Trump's goons are employing, or indeed even criminality, right, of the protesters / rioters in different cases, might cause one such conflict. I'm interested in that dynamic and how it pans out. I think it will be relevant to courts' determinations as to the existence of, for example, an insurrection. I'm also interested, and Kyle's first question alluded to it, the relationship between state and federal government, the federalism relationship, because that's going to be key and crucial. To what extent are the state governors, because most of this is going to happen in democratic states, are they going to play ball? Are they going to try to de-escalate, or are they going to try to, raise the tensions, raise their profiles? That's a decision that state governments are going to have to make. It's unclear how much legal authority they'll have to do anything other than file lawsuits and look for injunctions. And then finally, the party issue, the National Democratic Party. What are they looking to, and who are the leaders that are going to emerge that chart the right course?
So, Pisco, when I heard VP J.D. Vance the other day say that these ICE agents have, quote, absolute immunity, I couldn't believe what I was listening to, especially given the context of this is immediately after a 37-year-old woman got shot in the face 3 times in what appears like, to most sober minds, a killing that didn't have to happen. What the fuck? Because here you have, we've always been taught nobody is above the law, right? I mean, even the president is not above the law. Like, that's how we're supposed to act in this country and what we believe in this country. And then he invokes absolute immunity for these people. I understand that for law enforcement in particular, they do have like a higher legal bar, and, they tend to get a little more leeway than your average person. I get that. But when you say absolute immunity, I mean, the point I made is, if the immunity is absolute, are they allowed to rape people? Because you said it's absolute. So can they rape people? So break down for me what the actual legal standard is, and how it obviously differs from what J.D. Vance is saying.
Yeah, so J.D. Vance is talking out of his butt on some of this, okay? He's invoking Trump versus United States. He's invoking Trump versus United States. There's a notion of qualified immunity that certain officers have in the civil damages context. Okay, so when people start talking to you about qualified immunity, just know that it doesn't apply to potential criminal actions. That's a standard for judging whether you can find a government officer liable in a civil damages framework and for like departing too far from the Constitution. So there is some leeway there. But J.D. Vance is not talking about that, right? J.D. Vance is not talking about qualified immunity. You can't sue these people. What he's talking about is absolute immunity. And that is a concept that in this specific area, he's invoking with respect to Trump versus United States, which found that a former president, there are spheres of core and exclusive executive power by which he cannot be charged. And it's a little concerning that it's applying to, or at least he's proposing to apply it to lower officials as well, including just like line ICE officers. But it's not surprising Because think about the logic of the opinion of Trump versus the United States. In that opinion, the notion is the president needs to have no limit on these very core decisions that he's making. So take that and then add the notion that the entirety of the executive power is vested in one president. This is the unitary executive theory. Well, 1 + 1 = 2. If the president his authority can't be questioned in the core areas, and if all of the executive power is vested in the president and lower officials are just executing part of the power of the president, that's the theory, then why wouldn't lower officials who execute that power also have the immunity that Trump carries, right? That's why the opinion in Trump versus the United States was so dangerous, because it rested on a foundation combined with the unitary executive theory, could lead to these kinds of claims. And so that's what J.D. Vance is invoking. It is, of course, incredibly dangerous.
I think it's really important to dwell on this for a moment, because I did not put that together. When I heard J.D. Vance say that, I just assumed he was, grabbing for some hyperbole. But I also know, he is a Yale-trained lawyer.
Correct.
So he is, he is not an idiot. He's very intentional, right, with his language.
Yes.
And so what you're putting together, I think, is extremely important for people to understand, that this administration's position is that not only is it Donald Trump who is above the law and can do whatever he wants, so says the Supreme Court, but because he has that immunity, everyone, Stephen Miller, Kristi Noem, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, all the way down to the Proud Boy masked thugs who got 5 seconds of training before being sent out with guns to terrorize neighborhoods, that all of those people can do whatever the fuck they want, and there is nothing we can do about it.
Yes, and their internal logic makes sense, right? Their internal logic is when this Proud Boy ICE officer, whoever's doing this, right, is using any authority, that's just authority derived from the president. That's what it means to say that it's a unitary executive. All executive power is vested in the president. Well, if it all is there, then any use of official power is just a delegation by the president of the United States. That's why this case of Humphrey's executor, you might have heard reference to it, about the FTC and other cases involving executive branch officials who have some insulation from being fired from Trump. It's all related. They're trying to claim that the executive branch is his domain, right? But it's not just that, though. They're also trying to infect the other branches and say Congress can't do this, we can control appropriations, the courts can't review this. So it is a growing and expanding theory of power. But internally within the executive branch, their logic makes sense, right? You don't have to accept their logic, but their logic makes sense, which is all the power is Trump's. Trump's power contains immunity, and anyone who is using that power, borrowing it, it's as though Trump himself were on the streets. That's their theory.
Wow.
So
That's insane.
The feds are blocking an investigation right now. Can the state and local officials make a case without the feds' cooperation? Because at first they basically came out and said there's really nothing we could do if the feds don't cooperate. But then I heard some stuff that contradicts that after that. What's your assessment on that?
People have been convicted on way less, okay? I don't believe this whole, well, we need to have the ballistics, but it is true. And just, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider how insane it is that the federal government is icing out state investigators and state prosecutors from the investigation. That is so bizarre and wrong. And we just have to trust, after, by the way, firings in the very jurisdiction in which this occurred, because people are upset about what's going on within the federal government. We just have to accept their own investigation, which it's already predetermined. You don't need to ask the question. The guy's not going to get fired, and the guy's not going to get prosecuted from a federal perspective. So your question relates to, well, what can state governments do? I don't buy this whole, well, you need to have ballistics, you need to have the interviews they're having. No, I think that the state has jurisdiction here. If the officer is charged, which I think he should be, I want to be clear that this is murder, and we can talk about that if you want, about why I think that. He can invoke federal defenses. There's a statute which provides removal to federal court for officers in the line of duty who are being charged with offenses by state governments. That envisions, prosecutions of federal officers. So that clearly envisions Congress's decision to allow certain prosecutions from the state to continue. So I do believe that the Minnesota government has jurisdiction. I think that they should charge. We have eyes, we have ears, we can see the videos. Should they run a parallel investigation? Absolutely. Will there be an attempt to stop them? Yes, there will be an attempt to stop them. My view on it is you should subpoena these officials. You should do everything within your authority to at least try. And civil lawsuits are not enough. This guy needs to be charged with murder.
Yeah. Well, and actually the reporting suggests there isn't even the pretense of an investigation going on. In fact, you've had, career people who have resigned out of disgust.
Six of them.
That instead of investigating this guy for murder, you're investigating Renee Good and her wife for quote unquote domestic terrorism. I mean, that's how up is down, left is right that this whole thing has gotten. And, it's good to see some resignations. But to your point, we need a lot more than that. I want to get your reaction to that. I'm also curious on the specific technical question. If they do charge him and it gets removed to federal court, can Trump then pardon him? No, because it's still state charges. Okay.
Right. So the removal is just the forum. The idea is when we have our federal officers being charged by states, we want like a more neutral forum where there's more federal control. But it would just be the state prosecutors charging a federal officer in a federal court applying state law. And so that's what would happen. It would just be an application of state law principles by state prosecutors in federal court against a federal officer. So that's all the removal statute is doing. Now, the officer could try to invoke substantive federal defenses. There's this thing called the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which does say that like federal law is supreme, all state law and state decisions notwithstanding. But that's just gonna like re-ask the question of whether this shooting was justified under the Constitution and under the different deadly force policies that the federal government promulgates. And they're all kind of pointing at the same question of justification and self-defense.
In your professional legal opinion, explain why you think this meets the bar for murder, and then explain what you think their counter-argument will be.
Yeah, so murder is defined in the common law as the causing the death of a human being with malice aforethought and without justification. So just breaking that down, causing the death of a human being just means doing actions which are the but-for and proximate cause of the result here, which is causing the death. No one can seriously deny, right, that the shots killed Renee Good, right? That seems to be clear.
Yep.
Malice aforethought is a term of art. It's the mens rea component, and it usually encompasses intent or knowledge, practical certainty, in other words. Except for certain situations like heat of passion defense. If you remember, like the gay panic defense, there was a controversy about whether or not that should be included, extreme emotional disturbance, but none of that is at issue here. So the only real question is, for purposes of either malice or justification, is there a justification to eliminate those other elements? So because the person who shoots a gun at another human being's head, even if it's not their intention to kill that person, they're practically certain that death will result as an element. So the only real question here, it's unlike the George Floyd case in that respect, because in the George Floyd case, there were at least some colorable arguments that it wasn't the hold that killed him, it was fentanyl, it was this or that. Now, I think those arguments were conclusively debunked in the course of the trial by the pulmonary cardiologist, but causation is not really an issue here. The big issue is gonna be self-defense and justification, which brings us to their defenses they could raise. But I just want to stop right there in case you have another question.
Nope, keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. So their argument is going to be that the use of force here, it's not murder because it was publicly authorized. And it was publicly authorized pursuant to the Supreme Court's rule on the use of force. And the Supreme Court has established case law from this case, Tennessee v. Gardner, all the way recently to a case called Barnes v. Felix, which establishes the test of objective reasonableness when it comes to the use of force. That firing bullets, for example, is considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, and all seizures must be reasonable under the Fourth Amendment, right? And so they're gonna argue that here there was an imminent fear of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or perhaps the greater public, and that use of force was necessary to prevent that threat. I think that that's a bogus and stupid claim. I don't agree with it, but people can have differences of opinion.
Now, him violating the professional code and walking in front of the car, does that sort of negate their argument because he's not supposed to be doing that?
I don't think that that's going to be dispositive, by which I mean, I don't think it decides the case. There's unclear standards on whether officer-created hazards are relevant to the totality of circumstances inquiry. That the Supreme Court, in this case I'm mentioning Barnes v. Felix, specifically left open, and different circuits have different opinions about whether officer-created hazards that are unreasonable should be considered. The policies, I don't think, are dispositive, because you can imagine, right? Trump writes a policy tomorrow and says you can use force whenever you want. And so we, of course, don't think that the policy dictates what the law is. But why is the policy relevant? The policy is relevant to the risk analysis, right? We don't think that the officers who made these policies just randomly picked policies, right? Presumably, they're doing these policies, for example, not to shoot at moving vehicles except for certain specific conditions, because there's an intuition that those are less safe, right? And so in assessing not just whether there was a threat, but whether the use of force was objectively reasonable, of course, if the shooting in its nature from the perspective of the officer wouldn't have the tendency to lower the threat because of inertia, because of physics, right? The car's gonna keep moving at that distance, and it's gonna do what it's gonna do, regardless of whether or not Renee Good gets killed or incapacitated, right? Presumably the policies would inform what an objectively reasonable officer would think is likely given a shot at that distance, namely that the car's gonna keep moving, right? Which it did, right? The car is not connected to the life support of Renee Good, and it's not like a dead man switch that when Renee Good stops breathing, all of a sudden the car stops. Different case if it's like a madman who's attempting to ram into someone else, where shooting them obviously would prevent the threat, at least in some respect. Or let's say after a long high-speed chase, which some of these cases involve, that shooting them just to stop them from driving at all. It's a very different situation here. And don't be fooled by the comparisons to the fact patterns from different Supreme Court decisions, which are very, very different. Use the principles that the Supreme Court gave us and apply it in your common sense and day-to-day, and using the expert opinions of course, the people who wrote those use of force policies.
What's your take on him switching his phone? So he's recording with his right hand, and before he even gets in front of the car, he switches the phone to his left hand, which many people are arguing that shows that it's premeditated there. He was getting angry, going back and forth with Renee Good's wife. He's holding the phone in his right hand, switches it to his left hand to free up his hand to go for the gun, free up his right hand to go for the gun. Do you think that's an impactful argument?
I think that the premeditation is not necessary to the analysis, but for people who are trying to make the argument, I haven't tried to do this because I don't think there's yet enough evidence, but as more comes out, we start to realize this guy has a history of this, that he was part of an investigation involving potential pretexts to use force in different contexts. And then his comment afterwards, I forget what it was. It might have been like,
fucking bitch.
Fucking bitch.
Yeah. So I haven't yet made this argument because I'm just like still getting the facts of that particularly. But for someone who was saying, not only is this unjustified, it was pretextual, I think that kind of thing would be highly relevant. Yeah, you switch your hands in that context instead of stepping to the side because you were planning to shoot all along. And the sort of shuffling there and his demeanor and her demeanor and his seeming anger and annoyance, and I think the wife of the decedent said something like, you're fat or you're just thinking about your lunch or something. Yeah. I think those would all be highly relevant to the kind of pretextual argument. I don't think it's that probative, but there you go.
Yeah, because after the fact saying like, fucking bitch.
And then keeping the doctor away. What about keeping the doctor away, Pisco?
Well, I mean, that's another question too, is because, so you have her shot in the face 3 times. The killer walks away and hops in a car and goes. The other agents who were on the scene, as far as we know, provide no medical assistance. There's a physician there who says, hey, let me go check her pulse. Let me go see if I can attend to her. They do not let him do that. The ambulance that doesn't get there for another 10 or 15 minutes cannot get to her because their vehicles are blocking the way. I mean, are the other agents involved here who do not administer or even attempt to administer any sort of life-saving care, do they face any sort of legal jeopardy here?
I think that is less certain. They tried this with Chauvin, some of the other officers, and in general, the American rule is there's no affirmative duty to save or rescue, even for the police. That's the general rule. Now, there's differences if, for example, you're helping some sort of illegal application of force, or perhaps if you cause the situation yourself. But I'm not so convinced that there will be a theory of liability criminally from the perspective of people who failed to render aid or prevented aid from coming. Though those should be analyzed differently, right? Failure to render aid as opposed to stopping
blocking
people from
aid.
Correct, yeah. So I'm not saying that I know that will be one way or the other.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you the general rule. And additionally, but put that aside, right? Like, they should be fired. They should be fired for not rendering aid immediately. They should be fired for those circumstances. And obviously, even if the guy isn't charged or found guilty of murder, the shooter, I forget his name, he should be fired as well.
What about the the analyses that I've seen are fairly persuasive that Jonathan Ross didn't even get clipped even a little bit by the vehicle. But they're now out claiming, oh my God, he had internal bleeding and he was in the hospital and he's lucky he escaped with his life. And, you know, there are some videos where it looks like he may have been clipped. Does whether or not he was actually hit by the car, is that relevant at all? How does that factor into this fact pattern?
Hey guys, we had Pisco on the show today for Crystal, Kyle, and friends. Sign up below on Substack to see the entire interview. You don't want to miss it. We got into all the different legal arguments, the ICE stuff, the Venezuela stuff, the warmongering, and all of it. So definitely check it out. Sign up below.